There's the
Yes.
obvious economic fear that you lose your job. That's sort of the ultimate economic fear.
So much of that can be collapsed out now because of these tools. You don't need to do that anymore. So many functions that technology previously did can be done by a business user very easily and very quickly.
Hello again, Peter.
Hey, David. How are you today? I
Good.
see.
I'm a little chilly.
You know what? Your change of attire, I think, is more appropriate given the doomed snowstorm that just passed through New York.
I just couldn't make myself put on a bright, cheerful Hawaiian shirt because we just went through yet another blizzard in New York City, and I'm so over this winter, it's not even funny.
And you know what's scary? There's actually more on the horizon. I was looking ahead. There's a couple of days of snow the rest of the week, and yeah, it's chilly. It's chilly where I am. It's a mere, well, actually today it's cold. It's 40 degrees out. Hence the warmer shirt that I have on today.
So we have nearly the same temperatures because I think we're in the high 30s. Just the difference would be the 3-foot deep piles of slush outside my window from our
Yeah,
snowstorm in the last couple of days.
yeah. My background is more appropriate for me. It's kind of closer to what I'm looking at as opposed to what you're seeing.
I think the birds had it right. I'm going to start migrating south for the winter. This is crazy. Um,
You know what? I honestly can't say I blame you. It's still it'll at least be 60 here today, so it's not that bad. I'll take that
some
over
Somehow I
the
think
3 feet of snow.
this winter has made me understand my grandparents a lot more when they decided to like start going to Florida
I
in the
know.
winters. I'm like, I get it now.
I got to tell you, I haven't seen a winter like this in literally, I know we're old, but decades. I feel like the last time I've seen 30 inches of snow was I was probably a kid.
A little bit crazy. Well,
Yeah, it
but
is.
you know what? As the city in the Northeast crawls to a stop in the blizzard, the world of AI just keeps moving, right? It's been another interesting
Yes.
week.
Never a dull day. And I feel like it's accelerating. Well, not feel like it is accelerating. Every day is something new again. You and I opine on this constantly, but the rate of change is just absurdly fast. And I think equally is the range of opinions out there is growing exponentially also.
Yeah, it's a lot, and it's a lot for people to take in, especially if you're not spending your day and evenings, following AI, and you can see how people feel overwhelmed by it. So, which is sort of going to be a little bit of one of our topics today, the sense of overwhelm that people feel. But yeah, so this is episode 51, which is a little bit crazy. I think if I'm counting correctly, somewhere in
You
that
are.
order of magnitude.
You are. I'm impressed. It's quite a few. We have a lot of content these days and a lot of
We
views.
we do. We do. It's been great. So shall we jump into this one?
Yeah, let's jump. This is an interesting topic that we have today, and I think it's highly relevant given some of the work that you and I have been doing the last couple of months, also,
Yeah.
and validating some of what the article actually talks about. So yeah, this topic is really interesting. I think let's just dive into it and
Yeah.
kind of
All
get to the
right.
meat of it and go from there.
Let's do it. So there was an article that came out. It's in the current, so current being, I think it's technically the March,
Quarterly.
April 2026 edition of Harvard Business Review called Why Gen AI Feels So Threatening to Workers. And good article.
Yes.
And we're gonna kind of talk about the premise of the article. We're going to talk about what the authors of the article suggest as a way to help workers feel less stressed, and then we'll put our spin on it because I think we have our own thoughts and experiences in that arena as well, and
Yes.
should be a good
Yes. Yes.
conversation. Yeah.
They're all good conversations.
So let's
So
let's step back and talk about like people feeling overwhelmed. Do you see it like when you talk to people? Do you see people feeling overwhelmed with AI and what it means?
I definitely, and I will get it. Obviously, everybody has a different reaction, but I will say there is, I think, a decent cross section of individuals, professional individuals in white collar jobs who are have a sense of doom and gloom over it, and certainly a lot of fear. Which honestly, my sunny nature, I'm a little surprised sometimes, but when you hear it over and over and over again, it's certainly there are definitely people out there who are very afraid.
Yeah. It's interesting you said cross section because I think that's the other thing I notice is it's, other forms of automation that have happened have been disproportionately affecting, we'll say, the more physical, hands-on jobs than the more intellectual, cerebral, thought jobs. This one is a little bit different. Like this is just as likely to replace a camera operator as an architect, just as likely to replace someone on the assembly line as an attorney, right?
Yes. Yeah, no, and I think that's what scares everybody. It's all of a sudden virtually every job out there is in some way, well, every job out there will be impacted. I think we could safely say that. It's just a degree of impact, I think, is really hitting people pretty hard.
But it's funny because I almost feel like there's probably a segment of people who are looking at this going, finally, these white collar workers are starting to feel some of what other people have been feeling maybe for generations, right? Because we've had so many things, whether it's, digital manufacturing, offshoring, robotics, all of these things have come along and eroded people's confidence in certain types of jobs. And yet there's been a group of people that have been immune to it largely. And there's probably some people who are like, finally, it's hitting the rest of the workforce.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's totally fair. I think a lot of white collar jobs have been hit in the past. A lot of the offshoring initiatives that have been out there, certainly technology and engineering and even legal and radiology. But that said, it's never been quite as, I think, impactful as this is going to be. This is going far, far, far deeper than anything else out there, and it's going further up, I'll call it the food chain, than anything else has ever prior to this. And I think that's what really scares people. It's, people who are highly educated, deep domain knowledge, being, developed their expertise over many decades, are all of a sudden looking ahead and going, whoa, this is really going to impact my job in a major way.
Yeah, think about it. You spent decades developing expertise, the now what I'll call the old-fashioned way, right? You earned it through repetitions. You earned it through exposing yourself to other people, to work situations, and you gradually built up this set of knowledge. And now along comes a shiny new large language model or other AI model, and it can basically, quote unquote, learn what you took decades to learn almost overnight. That can't
exactly.
feel good.
No, I don't think feels good. I'll say this though before we jump into more of the article. I think you see a lot of, there's a take out there, there's a perception, there's an opinion out there that AI is going to eliminate smart people and eliminate the need for knowledge, or eliminate the need for intelligence, I should say. And I take a very differing view on that. That in fact, it's going to actually require more intelligence than ever before. And, it's not going to replace, if you have a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge, that's great. You're going to get more use out of the tools. All of a sudden, somebody who has no experience is automatically going to replace you. I don't see that ever happening anytime soon. But I think that's a lot of the narrative that's out there today. So I just want to state that.
Let's take you as an example, right? Like one of the skills, one of your many skills, but one of them that you've learned over years has been software development and coding. And yet I don't feel like you're threatened by the existence of AI code generation. In fact, probably the opposite, right?
Quite the opposite, actually. For the first time in a long time, I feel truly enabled and empowered to do things that I would look at a problem that I wanted to solve, and in the past I would have solved it by writing code and doing it the old-fashioned way, and sat there over months and built up the directory structure, decided what language, gone through all the architecture, the frameworks, the toolkits, the APIs I was going to have to use, and would have taken me months. Now, if I have an idea, I could sit down in the course of a day or two or a weekend, and I can have an incredibly powerful application up and running. But that said, I'm good at it because I have those decades of experience.
I was talking to a friend once who said, he was working on a startup, and he said he was getting tremendous productivity out of code gen tools. But he said the catch is you have to understand the details of the architecture you want, the frameworks you want to use, the languages, the tools, the databases, the connectors. If you can make those decisions and tell the model what to do, you can be terribly productive.
It'd be incredibly productive. I mean, you saw the POC that I developed recently. I mean, honestly, I could have never done that without my knowledge. I mean, I'm sure maybe I could have trudged through something with the tools, but my knowledge, my architectural experience, my real-time systems experience, that gave me the capabilities to do what I did and do it as well as I did it. Otherwise, it would have been a much more difficult problem I would have had to solve. I just didn't have the knowledge.
Yeah. So your stance on this really has been, and I think, tell me if I characterize you fairly, I think you have said several times that, I think a lot of people are probably overreacting out of fear and uncertainty, and that the
Yes.
people who are good at their jobs will actually ultimately be happy. They'll embrace AI, assuming it's rolled out properly in their organization, as making them more effective, more satisfied at work.
Right. No, I think that's a very fair statement. I think knowledge, look, I think once you understand, I think fear is usually born out of the fact that you just don't know. So, humans are really good at filling in the blanks of things they don't know. And most people, those blanks get filled in with negative thoughts, not happy thoughts. They always assume the worst. But I think when you start filling in those blanks with real knowledge about the capabilities and what you can do, and all of a sudden, maybe, I'm not going to say everybody, but you wake up one day and you're like, wow, I can do a lot more work, a lot more hard work, with my knowledge. I don't know. To me, that's incredibly empowering and powerful. And I don't know, that makes me happy, not concerned.
What's not to love about that? So let's, when we looked at this article, one of the things that they said, so I'm going to button up my lumberjack shirt and get ready for the deep dive here. One of the things the authors said was, they talked a lot about sort of like the psychological component to this, right? There's the obvious economic fear that you lose your job. That's sort of the ultimate economic fear. But there's also that psychological component of like, am I just going to hate my job if I have AI as a coworker? And they came up with this idea that there's like 3 psychological needs that you have in the job, right? Let's see what they were. They were competence, autonomy, and relatedness. Let's talk about those a little bit.
Well, I think we all want to feel, we want to feel good. Let me restate this. We want to know we're doing our job well. We want to feel most people want to feel competent at their jobs. And, if AI does it for you, you kind of lose that sense of satisfaction of being good at something. So, again, most of us, or a lot of people identify themselves through their job and what they do. Not everybody, but a lot of people do. And if you're all of a sudden, obsolete because of a set of tools, it's, you kind of lose that sense of like, what am I? I think it's obviously a big psychological factor with all the AI stuff that's out there. And, you don't want to feel incompetent because you think a tool is going to replace you. And as you and I have seen, it does not have to be the case. It can be quite the opposite, actually.
It's really interesting because I think half the reason that people would feel less competent, right, it is maybe we need to recalibrate how we measure someone's competence or effectiveness, right?
Yes.
Going back to code, I mean, one of the things that was, I've seen lots and lots of organizations, I'm sure you have too, where there's all these arbitrary metrics for software engineers, for example, and it might be lines of code produced, it might be number of commits or pull requests, or right. And those things are going to be directly impacted by AI. But like, that's going back to what you said, that isn't really a true measure of someone's effectiveness. Maybe we need to recalibrate. Like, yeah, I want to feel good at my job, but maybe I should think my job isn't writing lines of code. My job is coming up with a framework, an idea, an architecture, and then handing it off to a junior AI developer to
go execute it then in that case.
Right.
Like I always thought, to me, the best measure of software developer was your impact on the business. It wasn't lines of code. To me, that was an idiotic measure. I mean, look, you can write 5 lines of code as a senior engineer, but they're the 5 most difficult lines of code because you're writing some complex systems as opposed to 5 printfs. To me, that was always, for lack of a better way of putting it, it's really the impact you're having on your organization. That to me was always the best measure of success.
You know the old joke about the software engineer that gets called in to fix a critical system, and he gives the client the bill for fixing the system, and it's $100,000, and the client says, "What? Why $100,000?" He said, "I can give you an itemized breakdown if you want." He goes, "Yes, please do." And it comes back, and the itemized breakdown is fixing 5 lines of code, $5,000, knowing which 5 lines of code to fix, $195,000.
$195,000. That's the truth, though. I mean, look, in any complex system, it's knowing where to look, and that's based on experience.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So competence. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead. I was going to pivot on something completely different about COBOL, but we can come back to that one later.
No, I want to hear your COBOL example.
Oh, so Anthropic posted this thing on their website mentioning that all of a sudden Claude can actually read COBOL code and understand the interdependencies amongst the COBOL code. Now, you know that 95% of all financial transactions on the planet are still processed by COBOL code on mainframes. And getting COBOL programmers is almost impossible to find these days. So all of a
That
sudden,
was my
IBM,
retirement plan. My retirement
yeah,
plan was to brush up on my COBOL skills and go back and
hey,
freelance for a couple of banks.
you know what? I learned COBOL in college. I can pick up COBOL again if I really have to. But all of a sudden, the stock price of IBM dropped precipitously based on that
Didn't see
one
that.
post. Yeah, it took a massive hit because of that. So
Wow,
anyway,
that is wild. I like that. I like that example. We're living in the world of unintended consequences. Every time someone publicizes anything about what they've done with AI, it's really wild.
you're moving markets, which is scary. Anyway, so let's go back to the three things
Yeah.
that were mentioned
Okay.
in the article.
So competence was one. The second was autonomy, and that one I think really hits home with people, which is like, am I
Yes.
still in charge of what I do in my day, right? Or am I going to, am I effectively going to be a serf to an AI agent that just feeds me human tasks and says, do this, do this, do this all day long, right?
Right. I think that's a big thing for a lot of people. And look, in all fairness, that exists with or without AI. There are plenty of micromanagers out there who take away any sense of autonomy from you anyway. And you see how
Yes.
they react. Most people, it creates this psychological, I don't know, it hurts them. They're not productive. They're upset. And I think the thing with AI is all of a sudden, if you lose that autonomy to create, and that doesn't have to be the case, it's just going to happen on a much larger scale.
Right. I agree. I think autonomy is a management style and a company culture problem first and foremost. Introducing AI to a culture that doesn't promote a sense of autonomy will just make it worse. But
Yes. Yes.
it isn't probably
Absolutely.
the root cause of it, right?
So, but you bring up a really good point, actually, and inadvertently, I think you brought up a good point. Now, how much of this is rooted in a really good point? Inadvertently, how much of this is rooted purely in corporate culture? Because if you have a culture that is very control centric or micromanager centric, where you're tracking every little thing in the world, with or without AI tools, you're going to have autonomy issues. That's not going to go away.
Right. I think it's really interesting because we, as modern humans, we've become sort of accustomed to instant feedback, instant responses, right? I mean, how many people send you an email and then wait anxiously for you to reply within minutes to the email? And if they don't get the reply in 2 minutes, they send you a chat message. And I remember, at multiple jobs, I've taken a similar approach where I've said, look, I'm going to check email 2 or 3 times a day. I'm going to go hours in between checking it. If it's urgent, send me a message. And I've also said, if you want to have a detailed conversation, come see me or call me up or get me on a video call. I don't want to read through a 20 message email thread if we could have talked about it. And in one company I can think of, that was supported. In another company, it was heresy. And I got a lot of pushback on it. So that really made me feel less a sense of autonomy because
Yeah.
I knew that the best way to get a productive day in was to structure my communications a certain way. And when I didn't feel supported in doing that, I was like, now I am at the beck and call of my inbox all day long.
And exactly. And I worked at a similar company where, and I hate Jiras. I don't manage by Jira. It's not my style to manage by Jira. It's my style to talk to people and understand what they're doing. And I call them, this one group was management by Jira. And if they weren't doing a certain number of Jiras, and it was like, you had no autonomy over your day. And it was so pointless. And you saw the people and you saw how they were, and they were just basically miserable. It's just not a way, because I know autonomy over their work and what they wanted to do.
You're a cog at that point. You're just a widget.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're an expensive cog, is all they were. And they felt it. And there was no theme through, like, they had no control or anything. It was mind boggling to me. I'm looking at it from an outsider going, this is just frightening how this guy's operating. It just doesn't make any sense. But whatever. There's a lot of people like that.
And it's also a path to quick burnout, and you're not creating a lot of value because depending on what your job is, you need time to think, time to plan, time to analyze. And if you're in response mode all day long, when do you do those higher value tasks?
You don't. And that's why you burn
Right.
out fast. And that's what I saw. People turning over very quickly. And it was crazy.
All right.
I think
Well,
part
let's
of it's cultural stuff. But anyway, God, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, let's look at the third thing that they talked about, which was kind of an awkward word, but they call it relatedness, which is, does my work allow me to connect with other people and feel like I'm part of something? Interconnectedness is what I would call it, but pick a name,
It's a
doesn't
social
matter, I
aspect.
guess.
It's a social
Yeah.
aspect of life. I mean, I think it's funny because when I see some of the younger generation always saying all they want to do is work at home, I'm actually struck by that because I think it's really unhealthy. And I think, that social connectedness when you're working with people is important. It gets a meeting in a job. It's just so many positive aspects that coming out of social relationships. And they're worried that by doing or having AI take over big parts of their job, that all of a sudden they lose that capability. They don't have to talk to people anymore. And that is, I think, a valid concern.
Well, and it's a very valid concern. And working at home, for example, is convenient but unhealthy, which, a lot of things fall in that category. What strikes me is I'm going back to your examples earlier too, and it strikes me that AI could certainly exacerbate these problems. It could make you question your competence. It could make you feel less connected to people. It could make you feel a loss of autonomy. But I think deployed right, it could also make it better, couldn't it?
Oh, 110%. Absolutely. And I think that's what companies have to work towards, making it much more, making it help their people more efficiently and fulfilling these things, giving them competence, autonomy, and relatedness. I think, but you have to think it through. And I don't think that's happening today at most organizations, to be honest. I think what you and I are seeing is quite the opposite, actually, with the exception of maybe one or two cases.
Yeah. No, we've talked to a few organizations and worked with a couple that are, I think, doing the right thing. But yeah, most organizations are not yet figuring out the right thing. And the article actually offered some stats to back this up. They quoted some other studies that were done. I'll read you a couple of the nuggets that they quoted. There was a study by Mercer Global Talent Trends that surveyed 12,000 workers and said AI fear jumped
Yeah.
between 2025 and the 2026. The number of employees expressing a real fear of AI jumped from 28 to 40%. So, that's
Yes.
an arbitrary number, but it's growing, I guess, is the takeaway here.
Yeah. And look, you and I have seen that empirically. We've seen quite a few people express fear.
Yeah. The same study also said that the number of employees who said that their leaders underestimate the emotional and psychological impact of AI was 62%. Right?
Yes.
62% are saying our managers don't really understand how this is going to impact us in our sense of well being.
And I agree with that statement 110%. I actually am surprised the numbers aren't even higher than that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, I feel like the real numbers might be higher. And another interesting study, they cited something on Glassdoor, which I found very interesting, which is that workers generally are still very skeptical about what leaders are saying about AI. Leaders don't have the trust of their workforce when they talk about how great AI is going to make things because they aren't walking the walk yet.
No, they're not. And I think you look at it from a couple of levels. And I agree with that statement. I think most leaders look at it purely as a cost savings or productivity tool, not understanding the deeper implications of what it can do. And look, fairness, some of that's coming down from the board. You need to save money. This is a way of saving money. I venture to guess rarely is it we want to become more competitive and bigger. So we need to embrace AI and upscale our workforce. That's probably for a much smaller portion of the companies that are out there. But you know how most companies operate. Look, you and I have worked in finance for decades. We see how they operate. It's feast or famine. It's cut, 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 and then next quarter
Yeah.
hire like crazy. And
And,
it's
and look,
about
I am irate at some leadership teams of large companies in this world right now because they have
110%.
added to this fear. What they've
Yes,
done, and this is, Sam Altman mentioned this last week too. These companies are doing layoffs and downsizing that is economically necessary and has nothing to do with AI, but they're conveniently using AI as the scapegoat for it. And
100%.
it's not just dishonest. right? I mean, to me, you're borderline misleading your investors because you're
Yeah,
covering up
absolutely.
the underlying weaknesses of your company, but you're
Yes.
creating future problems for your own workforce because you're
Oh,
creating
absolutely.
an unnecessary fear of AI because you're blaming AI for fundamental problems in your business. Like that's just
Yes.
wrong.
Oh, no, it's wrong on multiple levels, but I'll take that even a step further. The big contributor to a lot of this too, and I will say this, the tech companies. I mean, I'm sorry, but
Yeah.
you hear, whether it's Anthropic or OpenAI or any of them out there,
AWS
and
did it too
they're
recently.
all saying it. It's
Yeah.
like, well, AI is taking over the world. There's going to be massive job cuts, and everybody's going to lose their jobs. So, while they are questioning companies who do it, they themselves are promulgating the fear. They're out there
Oh, yeah.
making this worse. They're not
Yeah.
saying, look at this as a force multiplier. It'll make your job better. All they want to do is sell seats. And I'm sorry, but they are making this 110 times worse than it needs to be. And now the scary thing is, at least to me, is the politicians are jumping on the bandwagon with this because they thrive on fear. That's how they operate.
Yeah.
And that makes it 100 times worse.
Well, the cynic in me says if you're a CEO and you need to do some layoffs because your business is underperforming, don't miss out on this. You've got a free get out of jail free card right now, which is you can cut and you can blame it on AI because everyone else is doing it and no one's going to look very hard at whether you're actually implementing AI to, replace the capacity you're cutting. That's
And,
a very
and
cynical take on it, but that is what's happening right now.
that's exactly what's happening. I don't think most companies right now, from what we've seen, and look, again, there are always exceptions out there that are truly understanding what it means to really implement this the right way, adjust your processes, make them AI enabled, upskill your employees the right way, not just give them a tool and say, write emails faster, which is pretty much all they've done.
Right.
And I see very few companies do, again, you and I have seen one or two, but most are not doing that right now.
Yeah. No, we're going to come back and talk about like what we think companies could be doing. So let's move into talking about what the authors of this article propose as like their mental model for how you start to deal with this. And by the way, I should just, to give credit where credit is due, I'll restate the name of the article and I'll mention the authors. So the article from the Harvard Business Review is Why Gen AI Feels So Threatening to Workers. The authors are Herman, Puntoni, and Morwedge. So props to them. It was a well-written article. I thought it was interesting reading. And they propose a framework. So let's replay or talk
Let's
about what they
play.
proposed.
Yeah, let's go through their framework, and I'll say this up front. It's a psychological heavy framework, and I do think there's a massive psychological component to implementing this the right way. And look, I'll hark back to my days of Maslow and all those other things, and you have to look, you got to look at the employee if you really want to grow your organization. But let's start with their framework, and they call it the AWARE framework, which is an acronym for. I'll say it, and then we'll walk through each individual one: aware, watch, align, redesign, and empower. So why don't we start with the first one, just acknowledge, and acknowledging that their fears are real and valid, and they shouldn't minimize them.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's saying, they're saying you should acknowledge it. The leaders should openly say, look, we realize this is hard for you, and kind of put out there into the discourse that this can feel threatening, can feel disconcerting and disrupting. Yeah. All right.
And I think just acknowledging feelings like that, it takes away some of the power or the emotions that people are feeling. If they at least feel like heard on some of this stuff, might not alter the outcome, but at least they feel heard. And I think that's a big deal. Leaders need to be proactive on this. Again, this is going to be a massive change in any organization, and I honestly don't think people fully realize the scope of the change it's going to have.
I think you're right. And I read this and my first reaction to acknowledge was, seems fairly obvious. But then I started thinking about the organizations that we've seen rolling out tools, and, they might view it as, oh, it's just early days of our AI transformation, but yet they're rolling out tools, personal productivity AI tools to employees, and they're doing it absent this dialogue. And so the employees are just left to wonder what's going on here. Like, is there an ulterior motive?
And you and I have seen this firsthand. We've seen this.
Yes.
Multiple times.
Yes. And in fact, unfortunately, it's the norm rather than the exception that they just roll out these tools and hope for the best.
Yes, I concur with that.
Okay.
So there are not many enlightened organizations. Let's leave
No.
it at that.
Yes.
So watch. Now let's watch. So you're watching your employees. And what that means is really monitor for signs of fear and resistance and disengagement across the organization and pay attention to those that are struggling where resistance is concentrated. Now, I don't disagree with this philosophically. I think any good manager wants to keep eye on their employees and look for obvious signs. I will also follow along with, not everybody's a psychologist either. It's hard to always keep in the weeds.
How do you recognize it? Yeah.
Exactly, recognize these types of issues.
I mean, they've always said the most, dangerous employee is the one who like pastes on the grin, goes to the office every day and hates it, and is secretly preparing their exit plan because they feel unloved, unappreciated, etc. So I think it is hard to know exactly who's, you can see the open resistance, but it's hard to see that more latent resistance that builds up.
And you're right, and I think in fairness, I mean, look, AI can certainly cause this. I mean, but there are other things that can cause this, and disentangling what's causing it are two different. It's hard. And look, as a manager, when you're trying to meet deliverables and help and do other things, this is very people intensive. It's hard. So just saying it up front. But their next one was align incentives, culture, and leadership behavior with AI adoption, and make it safe to engage, and don't punish hesitation or early stumbles. This I fully agree with, and I think that is very often a big problem. And what is said by senior management, we're embracing it, but those that using it are getting punished for using it, or using it incorrectly even though they don't know how to use it. That's a real problem.
And it's something we've talked about a lot, this whole idea of using it incorrectly. Like, it's not necessarily bad to use it incorrectly if you learn from the experience and you haven't permanently broken anything along the way, right?
Right. And I think the way you learn how to use it is to play with it and break things.
Break things that's
not encouraged.
That are not critical and can be replaced. Don't break the family jewels, but break.
Right. But as well as I do, most organizations don't like that strategy. They don't want to break things. They don't want to spend the time. But, you're teaching a new set of skills, and you have to. Things are going to break. I'm sorry. You need to be aware of that. I need to facilitate it almost.
And the point about aligning, with leadership behavior, I think is also really important. You and I have talked about this many times, that like leadership on the use of AI has to be visibly coming from the top. It can't just be a proclamation from the top. It has to be, leaders need to model the behavior that they want to see.
Many years ago, I went back early in my career, I would read tons and tons of management books and psychology books. And, the one thing you always learn is a leader has to align what they say with what they do. And I think a lot of companies are really good at with the say part and saying the right thing, but aligning their values with their actions are two different things. And it's hard because it's time consuming, and it's, you have to constantly remind yourself of what you said to make sure you execute on that. And that's hard. And that's why I think most organizations fail at this.
Yeah, no, it's very hard. And I think, a lot of leaders, with all the best intentions, they don't walk the talk, right? So I'm even thinking of, managers I've had in the past who would say that they were very supportive of people making time, not working 24 hours a day, making time for other priorities in life, etc., as long as the work's getting done, but then they wouldn't model that. And if they didn't model that behavior, no one took it serious. No one really believed that they were giving you permission to sign off and not check emails at 10 p.m. Like, you've got to actually model the behavior that you want to see.
It's like companies who say, well, you have unlimited vacation days, just take as many as you want. And then when you look at how many people have taken vacation days, 95% of the employees have taken like 2, because nobody wants to do it. It's a trap at the end of the day. In fact, I would say it's a trap to take fewer vacation days, not more, because when it's there, nobody does it and nobody models it. So it's never going to happen.
Totally agree. Well, so let's talk about what's the next one, the R in aware?
Redesign how work actually gets done with AI as a genuine partner or genuine input. And I think you and I have said this a million times because I think this is extremely true. And this even goes back to the days of just pure statistical analysis. You have to redesign your processes around the technology. It's not bolting on this for a segment of a process. I mean, yay, you can try to do that and it might work in some cases, but generally speaking, you have to look at your processes holistically and redesign them, knowing you have now call it an intelligent partner or n number of partners.
I fully agree with that, and we can talk more about that one. I think that one's spot on, though. You can't just parachute in a bunch of AI models into an existing business process and expect it to work.
No, most definitely not.
Finishing up the catchy acronym was Empower.
Right. And I
What
don't
does
disagree
that
with this.
mean?
I actually agree with this. It's like giving employees basically say in how it's adopted within the organization. And I think that gives them a sense of ownership, which is really important. And they'll, look, if you know how it's going to be adopted, or you're at least a voice in that adoption process, you're more likely to embrace it and use it as opposed to push back on it.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, so they're basically saying this aware framework, is one of the ways that you should start to frame your thinking. It's acknowledge, watch, align, redesign, empower. Makes sense. I think we've been working on these problems as well, and we probably have we can stay with that aware concept. I think what's interesting, if we peel it back a little bit, is some of them are more critical than others. Some are really the linchpins of this. What would you say is the most important part of this? I mean, because look, let's acknowledge, I love a good acronym, but the problem with the good acronym is it also, you kind of have to torture your mental model to fit the acronym, right? Like it's a little bit unnatural at times.
Oh, it's very, 100% agree. And it's, it becomes very consulting speak. And I think people or employees recoil when they hear some of the stuff and like, oh, another consulting acronym I have to now deal with and worry about. And I still have my day job and I still have all this other stuff and yada, yada, yada. And I get that.
Yeah.
I think
to be fair, in the constraints of one article, they couldn't go deep on how to implement all these things, all these recommendations. So let's talk about because I read that and I was like, all right, it all makes sense. But, we all know the hard part is the doing.
The hard part is definitely the doing. And look, I'll say this. We're early days in any of this stuff. And there's a lot of unknowns and there's a lot of unknown unknowns. I think, but based on what we've seen so far, look, we've spoken to many, many hundreds of thousands of people by now. We've seen a lot. And I will say, if I had to say, where do I start within an organization? First, clearly it takes buy-in at the top. I think that goes without say. But then what follow on comes from that. Before you do anything else, it's education. I think education is an absolutely critical cog in this to move the ball forward. And without that education, you're not getting anywhere anyway. But to me, that's the first massive step any organization should take. And I don't mean education about, how do you write a prompt? I mean, clearly that maybe it's part of it, but deeper education, a broad cross-section of information on the power of the tools, the power of the paradigm, how it's going to affect you, things to start thinking about all the way through, because I think that's incredibly important. Don't you think?
I 100% agree. And as you were saying that, I was thinking that a lot of companies are beginning to be hit or are about to be hit with what I would call a very dangerous knowledge asymmetry. And what I mean is this. You're going to have two classes of people in your company. You're going to have generally younger workers who understand a lot about AI. They've grown up as AI natives almost, right? But they don't know the business. They don't have the experience and the judgment and the wisdom. And then you're going to have a cohort of workers who know all those things about your company and have deep domain expertise, but they are less comfortable with AI. That's a dangerous combination, right? The people who know how to work the tools don't know how to wield them, and the people who know how the tools should be wielded don't know how to work the tool.
Couldn't agree more. I absolutely agree. And I think company it's scary,
it's
actually.
It's a recipe for disaster.
That is the very definition of disaster, impending doom. And I think unless you get that and get in front of it before it becomes a problem, because it will become a problem, you're incredibly naive as a leader. But you're right, though.
By the way, the disaster is, we're already starting to see the disaster. Like, this is maybe, I'm probably stretching this point to this example, but I'm going to do it anyway. And that is, you probably read the same article I read in the last few days that AWS disclosed that some of their outage, a recent outage or a recent loss of service was caused by an AI agent that analyzed human written code, decided it could do better, and replaced that code, deleted that code with the intention of rewriting it. But it deleted it from a production library and caused an outage. So this, to me,
No, I didn't read
that's
that
a
actually.
human.
I didn't see that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So an agent analyzed the code and said, I could write this code more effectively. No argument there. But the human who is in charge of that agent didn't have the experience, I'm going to guess, didn't have the wisdom.
No, you're probably right.
And allowed that agent access to a production code library. So when the agent went and deleted the code to rewrite it, that subsequently triggered a cascading series of events that resulted in an outage. Now, obviously, deleting source code doesn't immediately cause an outage, but that, it deleted an essential component from a production library, and someone recompiled something later, and, it all blew up.
So, there's this aspect of human brain development that often goes underlooked. And we tend to think as we get older, our brains change as we get older. We know that. That's not even a question.
Unfortunately, I do. Yeah. No.
Yeah, but look, in some respects, they get infinitely better as you get older. I mean, you get the benefit of wisdom. Wisdom comes with age, and it comes at how your brain restructures itself over time. Your brain operates very different at 40 and 50 than it does at 20. And that's why a lot of the major breakthroughs and Nobel Prize winners tend to be on the younger side, primarily because your brain functions, that type of thinking, well. And as you get older, though, you think deeper and broader. And that comes with knowledge acquisition and over time and, pulling and reading and all these different subjects that you learn over decades. But instead of looking at the problem, you look at the implications, of course, you look at it just very deeply. So you can't separate the two. The way you get there is through learning when you're young of what to do and what not to do, and you gain wisdom over time. Removing that component of junior employees to actually learn and make mistakes and develop is a strategy that is just, I'm sorry, so deeply flawed and naive, it's idiotic. But you see it playing out today with all these organizations who are not hiring young people instead. So you're not giving them the opportunity to learn these critical skills that they are going to need to become future leaders of your company. And I am baffled that companies think that's a good strategy. To me, it is so myopic and epically idiotic. I just don't see how that's a good thing, ever.
I agree. So if we were implementing the AWARE framework, we'd probably break the acronym first by adding another letter to it. We'd add the E for education,
Yes.
or T for teach. It could be TAWARE. I don't know what it would be, right? But we'd start with education, right? Good.
Yes.
I think that's, I couldn't agree more. I think that is absolutely necessary because you want to be able to sort of get people, back to what we have said many times, some deeper understanding of what these tools are good at, what they're not good at, what the limitations are, etc. And, right now they just appear as a magic easy button all too often to too many people.
And exactly. And it's not a magic easy button. And I'll say this further since I'm opining a lot this morning. Maybe I got up early and drank too much coffee. I don't know. There is you and I have been in tech for a long time. Let's face it. And, technology people are not the most psychologically aware all the time. Their social skills are on the lower end of the spectrum, as opposed to other types of individuals. That's just a known fact. I'm not stating anything that's not true. And, looking at aware, it really requires, I think, a level of psychological awareness, especially about the people, and being able to read people more effectively than most individuals actually possess.
Yep.
And I think that's critical, especially when you're going to go through something that is, we'll call it traumatic, deeply changing, whatever you want to call it, but it is deeply changing, and it's going to impact a lot of people deeply depending on where they are in their career. And, if as a manager or as a leader, you need to be somewhat psychologically aware of what's going on. You're able to read people better, and a lot of people don't possess that skill. And I almost think that, education is important, but that aspect of the education is just as important.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. It's not just technical education that matters here. Okay, so moving on, I think our tip of the spear will be around education. I think we said we would put acknowledge, redesign, and empower as sort of the next priorities. So slightly rearranging the acronym a little bit. Let's talk about the acknowledgement, right? Because I think we agreed with the intent of acknowledge, but I think it needs to be really needs to go deep. It can't just be okay. It's scary. We get it. We hear you. More to it than that, right?
What was the follow on? Okay, it's great. I hear you. I understand what you're saying. And it doesn't mean I continue on doing exactly what I was doing if it's going to hurt you.
I also
That's,
think that transparency is part of what's called for here. It's beyond just saying, yeah, we know this is going to be painful. Tell me what's going to hurt. Tell me how it's going to hurt, where it's going to hurt, when it's going to hurt. Not to make it sound too noble, but I think a lot of people can handle challenge if they're equipped for what's coming, if they know what to expect. So I would have a lot more comfort being in an organization where someone was candid and said, yes, look, certain types of roles are going to be affected more than others. Here's our goal with this. And, if a manager stands up and says, I know it's hard, but our goal is we're not going to have any disruption, I'm immediately going to discount that. But if they stand up
oh
and
yeah.
they give me a nuanced, transparent view, including what they know and what they don't yet know about how this is going to impact us, don't lead me on. Let me, treat me like the adult I am.
Well, and I think that's the crux of the issue. Most leaders aren't congruent in what they say and what they do. They'll say what they need to say at that moment in time, deflecting the problem till a later date when the problem becomes deeper and worse.
And I think the problem is amplified with AI because most
Well,
leaders
yes.
truly don't know what the impact of AI is going to be, nor should we expect them to. I'm not saying that they don't know because they're negligent. I'm saying it's unknowable. But that
Right.
transparency to
100%.
be like, you need to admit that it's unknowable. You need to say, look, we're all on this
Right.
journey together. I don't know. I can't sit here and tell you what this is going to mean for each role and job in this company. But
Well, you
at
and I
least
say,
acknowledge that.
and you and I say it all the time. We don't know yet. We don't know. And I hate when people get up there or, it's in the press that this is going to happen, that's going to happen. I'm sorry. You just don't know the implications yet. And it's going to be a long time before we really do. I can tell you with some certainty that there will be deep changes. I know that is an absolute. But I think every organization is going to respond and react differently. Every organization has a different personality, different leadership, different values, different everything. As most humans are going to respond differently. And every organization is going to have a different path. We don't know. All we can say is there's going to be a lot of change, and you really should be prepared for this. And most are not even thinking about
And,
it.
and the problem, very, very straightforward, is you only have to make a promise and not keep it once or twice to lose credibility, right? So if you
Exactly.
stand up there and say, oh, this is going to be painless or this is going to make your lives 100 times better, the minute someone disproves that, you've lost the credibility to lead people through a tumultuous transition.
Yes. And look, people accept you'll make mistakes in this journey because it just is, but just acknowledge that up front. I mean, it's got to be a level of awareness and um, I don't know, definitely a level of self-awareness that this is going to do or create a lot of uncertainty. And I
I
don't
want to
think,
say
again,
acknowledge and communicate in an ongoing way. Like that's all part
constantly,
of it, right? Yeah.
constantly,
Okay.
especially this journey is tough. So you need to
Right.
communicate all the time.
All right. The next thing we said is a huge priority, kind of on the same level of knowledge is redesign. This to me is probably up there with education. Is the most important thing you can do is
Yes.
redesign business processes. And I feel like
Yes.
here's the problem with an acronym like R is the AWARE. It's the fourth out of five letters. Of those five letters, it's the most important. It's the most fundamental. Like
No, I agree.
redesigning business processes.
And that to me is in some ways I won't say the easier one, but a little more palatable one, I think. Yes, you can't just, again, again, you and I have said this for a long time, you can't just bolt it on. You need to really think about the processes from beginning to end, where people are involved, touch points, and how AI is really going to impact this. And I almost want to say you need to make the processes not rigid, because the technology is changing so fast, chances are you're going to be changing your processes more often than you have in the past.
Yeah. So, and when I am trying to convince people that they need to be open to this idea of redesigning processes, there's really sort of two things that I hit on really hard with them. Like, one is, if you've gone through the education process, right, it should be painfully obvious by the time you've learned a little bit about how modern AI tools work. It should be painfully obvious that they aren't human-like. They can mimic humans, but they don't work the way humans do. And so it should follow that you can't drop an AI tool into the middle of a process that is designed around humans and expect it to just seamlessly take over a task that a human used to do. It doesn't work that way. Right?
No, most definitely doesn't work that way. But that's not how it's often being pushed. But yeah, no, it doesn't work that way. And when you redesign a process to do tasks that humans previously did, you still need to make sure, even as a human in a loop and you're augmenting it, whoever is that person still needs to grow and develop and not just become a cog in a wheel and going, yes, that's good. Yes, that's good. Yes, that's good. And not learning and growing from it. Still, you need to have that ability. And you need to think about that when you redesign the processes.
The other argument that I give is that, from a psychological and job satisfaction standpoint, like most of our jobs have elements that are just no fun. And then there's the stuff that's really challenging, right? So if you just keep the process the same and like put AI in, you're missing the opportunities to rethink, how do I make it most effective, enjoyable, satisfactory, and challenging for the human, right? Because the nice thing about an AI model is they don't complain about getting dealt the junk work, the repetitive, monotonous stuff, right? So let's capitalize on that. Give them the repetitive, monotonous aspect of this job and figure out how to redesign the process so the humans are getting the fun stuff, the challenging stuff, and the stuff that develops their brains.
Right. No, I agree. But most organizations, you and I know this. Look, we've worked at how many organizations between the two of us? They don't think that way. Employee happiness is, I'm sorry, they all give it lip service, but it's not something they tend to focus on. And I always feel like AI is going to make that worse because they're quarter by quarter driven.
Yeah, and I think, we've seen this cycle many, many times. I can't count how many times I've seen it. Employee happiness doesn't matter when it's an employer's market, but when the job market turns, happiness matters. Well, I think right now a lot of people are assuming that happiness doesn't matter because we can just, they almost want people to quit so they can replace them with AI. Short-sighted.
If they even know what that means. Right. Short-sighted, if they even know what that means.
Right. The other interesting aspect, let's talk about this aspect of who has to do this. If we're saying that you should redesign a business process, well, who is it? Who in an organization is qualified to redesign a business process? Is it IT or is it the business?
More often both hand in hand because there are implications. But yeah, I mean, generally it's the business side redesigning the process because they're the ones that understand the business. IT is often the one responsible for implementing that. But in some respects, with the new tools, that minimizes their role dramatically because you don't need them as much as you did in the past.
And yet, we still see a lot of companies that are putting IT in the driver's seat of rolling out these tools. And that is a mistake. You cannot do that. IT has a seat at the table. They need to be part of the team. I get that. But the adoption of these tools and the integration into the business has to be driven by the business. Only the business understands 100%. Their existing process and challenges and weaknesses and strengths enough to figure out how to deploy this.
Right. No, I couldn't have said it better myself. But and again, most businesses have spent multi-decades outsourcing a lot of their knowledge to offshore facilities. And now all of a sudden, their IT teams are sitting offshore, but now the business can do a lot of this stuff. I don't know. I think it creates a lot of issues going forward.
I mean,
to figure this out.
It has, unfortunately, in a lot of organizations I've seen, sort of sown the seeds for a little bit of a battle for control between technology and the business around AI.
Yes.
And it's a shame that it comes down to that because it should be a partnership.
It should be a partnership. Absolutely.
But it's a partnership where the business must own decisions about when, how, and where to deploy AI.
Yes.
And it's enough said about that.
No.
It's if you're handing this over to IT and having them roll out tools and not giving the business a seat at the seat at the head of the table, you're never gonna get it.
No, and it's funny because I look at some organizations that I've worked at in the past, and when I started out, the business and IT literally sat on the same desk together. So there was no divide. You were one and the same. You were congruent in the sense that you wanted the business to do well, and that's what you work towards. And over the years, there's been layers put between and outsourcing and all this other stuff. So much of that can be collapsed out now because of these tools. You don't need to do that anymore. So many functions that technology previously did can be done by a business user very easily and very quickly.
Yeah. Don't even get me started on the whole collapse of the software as a service economy, because that is that's that concept taken to an extreme.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
So
yes.
I think redesigning the business process, massive, critically important thing. And part of that, which we sort of leaned into just now, is who does it? The business. And that's part of empowering the business. So I think the other key thing that we really would focus on is the empower part of this framework. Let's talk about that.
No, I agree. Empower employees, but how do you exactly empower employees? Now, I think from a business
what does that really mean?
What does that mean? I mean, look, I guess empowering them to be part of the process changes. Yeah, I would think they should be. I could look at empower multiple different ways. From a business perspective, it's empowering them to do business. And I always used to say at the speed of business and not the speed of IT, which tends to lag the speed of business usually dramatically.
And I also look at it as empowering them to be part of this transformation, to drive the transformation. Here's the thing. In today's world, the typical pattern in technology is a business person says, I want this to happen. They sort of describe an end goal, and technology decides how it happens. Technology is deciding, is this an application? Is it insourced? Is it outsourced? What's the database? What's the tool? Right? I want the business to be the person who discovers the solution.
Yes.
Right? And then
I don't want them
turns to IT for help making it real, but the business needs to discover. Where discovery is my word of the day. I want a business person to experiment and discover how AI can help them in a particular process.
Yeah, and what I don't want to see happen, which has traditionally happened, the business might want to change a process, and the IT is dictating the how, the when, the where, all the above. Business might want it next week, and IT is telling them next year, and that all needs to go away.
And I agree. It needs to go away, and it needs to be replaced by experimentation. Discovery comes as a result of good, controlled, well-structured experimentation.
100%. 100%. And the tools have gotten so sophisticated that previously non-technical users can use these tools to truly experiment.
So if you're a business leader, you should be providing your teams with a safe, controlled sandbox where they can experiment with tools. Safe and controlled, yes, but where they can play, they can experiment, they can test things, they can evaluate things. And at the end of the day, they should be the ones who say, Eureka, this is how this tool could help me with this step in this process. Not go to IT and say, hey guys, how can you help me with this step? That's not effective.
No, it's not. It's not. It's funny as I'm thinking as we're talking through all of this, and it's dawning on me, or maybe it has dawned on me prior, but it's really the scope of the organizational changes that need to take place are so deep to make this stuff so incredibly to reach the limits of what it's capable of doing.
If I were a writing an article and I really wanted to get a clickbaity title, I think at this point I'd be planning an article talking about the coming civil war between business and technology. Because what we're really talking about is the business over decades has abdicated certain things to the IT department because the technology was just too complicated for them to understand, or that was the conventional wisdom. We're now saying take back that power, and the reality is there are pieces of this puzzle that IT has gotten used to doing that they're not going to want to give up, because whoever wants to give up power?
No.
They need to.
No, agree. I would venture to guess, if I had to look at the crystal ball right now, the vast majority of what IT does today would probably go away. I mean, I think they should focus on infrastructure. They should focus on security. They should focus on, data management, making it readily available. But outside of that, honestly, I think a lot could be pushed back to the business.
Yeah. I mean, look, there's always, you and I have talked about this many times. There's always going to be really hard technical challenges that you
Yeah, of
can't
course.
solve with AI. There's going to be a need for IT to take AI solutions that are piloted by the business and make them production ready and sustainable and hardened. So, like, we're not saying you don't write code anymore in IT, but all of those steps in between of sort of taking the business's intent and desire and translating that into technical design, we need to give that accountability back to the business.
100%. 100%. But again, most organizations, that's going to be a huge battle. It's going to be a political battle. It's going to play out over many years. It's not going to happen overnight. And look, people make things hard. Let's face it. It's face reality. It's
And
going
I
to
look
take a long time.
I would say to an IT leader or a business leader who funds IT, like just look at what's happening in the software as a services market, which again is a topic for another day. But we are seeing evidence already that companies are saying, well, no, I'm not going to pay you to write me this software because I'm just one of your 10,000 customers and you may or may not give me the feature I want when I write it. I'm going to use AI to create my own version of this software because I control it. That's a shift
exactly.
that is starting to happen in the software market. So
Yeah,
why
no,
would
great.
you think that an internal IT department would be exempt from that?
No,
It shouldn't.
they're not.
It isn't.
But again, a lot of these changes that where we are today played out over many decades, from where we started. And I think, and granted, I don't think it's going to take that long to unwind it, but it's going to take time to unwind it. It's going to take a massive shift in how you perceive all of this and how you organize your organization. And that's just going to take time before that happens. And again, most organizations they don't have their minds wrapped around anything like that. It's business as usual. And I'll make an argument that I think it'll be a lot of smaller firms that come up and compete with the bigger firms that are doing things very differently. In many cases, it's easier for them to get there than a bigger company. And the old proverb about turning the battleship. It's hard.
Right. Agility and nimbleness is going to be important. Absolutely.
Massively so. And most organizations.
Let's hit the last two parts of the AWARE framework, watch and align, because I think I agree that they're necessary ingredients, but again, to me, they're just less critical than the redesigning processes, the empowering and the acknowledgement. But yeah, watching and aligning is like this. Just to me is sort of table stakes. It just says, like any transformation, you're going to monitor and measure the progress of the transformation, and you're going to continuously tweak and adjust things to keep it headed in the right direction. Because you can't have a transformation plan that's carved into a stone tablet, right? Especially when technology is changing as fast as AI is.
Yeah, and especially since you don't know how everybody's going to respond to it. And you don't know who's going to push back, and it's often those that you think are going to push back are the ones that embrace it more than anybody. I think these are valid. I don't think they're easy. I mean, look, any manager should be aware of their people and how they're responding, and look for subtle hints and the resistance and everything else. But this is happening on a different scale now, so it's going to make it a lot more complicated, I think.
That's a fair point, and I think the identifying those pockets of fear, resistance, discomfort, etc., might be hard because no one wants to stand up and say, actually, I'm afraid of this stuff, or I don't get it, or whatever. So you may have to put a little more effort into that.
I think so. I think a lot more effort, there is no easy way for this. But the easy way is to create a culture that allows it to happen. Allows it to people to voice their opinion and not slap them down and tell them why they're wrong all the time. Well, you feel the way, that's great, but let me tell you why you're wrong. It doesn't kind of fly. You have to listen, really listen, in order to absorb some of this.
Creating a culture is a necessary part, but at the end of the day, and maybe this is part of the alignment process too, you can say all you want about the culture, but you've got to make sure that what you pay people for is what you are saying you want them to do, right? Like there's no greater sin in a company culture than telling people to do one thing, but paying them to do something different. Yes. So I think you really need to look at how your role definitions, compensation schemes, etc., are going to support the behavior you actually are saying you want to see.
Yes, I agree. And that is challenging, as you know, to do that. And there's I would argue a large disconnect there. So,
Yeah, but I think any headline grabbing attempt to just, hey, we're going to do it this way is going to fail. Like I read the other day about a large consulting company. I'm not going to name them, but apparently they have made a part of everyone's performance evaluation be like, how much are you using generative AI in your work? And again, I haven't seen the details of what they're doing, but my immediate reaction is you got to be really careful with those things, because if that translates into just some sort of, coarse grained metric that are you using it this many times per week or per month, that's not the behavior you really want.
No, it's not the behavior, exactly not the behavior. In fact, you want the opposite. It's like, what's the quality of the work you're producing with the tools? Not because I logged on to, ChatGPT 12 times this week. That's not it goes back to the software metrics. They're nonsensical. They don't make a lot of sense. How many lines of code you're writing? That is not a metric that makes any sense. This makes no sense. Giving people these tools, and you and I have said this a million times, doesn't make them productive. In fact, they can be the quite opposite. They can create a lot of work that takes away productivity. I don't think corporations know how to measure any of this stuff right now. I think it's going to take time, but I think it takes some real requirement on being very thoughtful about how you do some of this stuff. There are always places you can apply it fast. I'm not going to argue that. Absolutely.
I was speaking to a client a month ago who brought me the internal reports they had that were tracking the usage of a pilot group of people who had gotten access to some AI tools. And it's just a few hundred people. And it showed that there was very steep uptake. These people got the tool and they used it X number of times per week. But then after 4 or 5 weeks, the number of uses per week started dropping. And they were concerned about this. And they said, what should we do about this? Is this indicating an erosion of, desire to use the tool? And it's like, I get it. That might be the story. But the other story is maybe people are figuring out where it's effective. Maybe this is actually indicating people transitioning from a shotgun approach where they're just trying everything to a more surgical approach where they're gradually learning and they're using it only in cases where it's effective. But yet the knee-jerk reaction was, no, we've just paid a lot of money, $32 a month per seat for these people to use this tool. We've paid a lot of money and now the usage is dropping. That's a problem. That isn't indicative of a problem, but it goes to your point, which is we often don't spend enough time thinking about these metrics and what they really mean and what they can tell us.
No, absolutely not. No. And there's not a lot of thought that goes in. And that's, there's just not a lot of thought that goes into them. And they get the knee-jerk negative reaction to everything.
Metrics madness, it's everywhere.
It drives me crazy. And look, and I was a person that, like you, we ran analytics teams, we focused on numbers, we did metrics, we did all this stuff, but you have to be able to understand what the number means. And there's got to be a lot of context around a number. A number in and of itself is meaningless.
I'm a huge believer in metrics, but man, they can be dangerous if you misinterpret them and don't understand them.
And a lot of people are very dangerous at misinterpreting numbers and will use them the wrong way. And you and I know that. We've seen it happen many, many, many times.
Yes.
And diving into the real underlying issue takes time and being thoughtful about it. So, but the last point we have here, maybe we'll discuss it briefly. Incentive design matters more than culture posters. Yeah, I agree with that. I don't like culture posters. I think they're pretty dumb, actually. I hate the old, give us every firm has them, their set of values that they got to publish all over the place, written by committee that are fairly meaningless.
Yeah.
But, but it's hard to
skip the posters telling me what you think I should be doing and be really direct and clear. This is the behavior we want, and we're going to pay you to do that behavior. That's what I'm going to do. Because at the end of the day,
exactly.
Everybody is going to, if you're placed in an impossible decision between do it you're telling me to do versus do it I'm actually being compensated for, you're going to take the one that's going to get you paid every time.
Right, of course.
Right.
Absolutely.
It's human nature.
Yeah,
and it's not a flaw, it's a feature of human nature. You should. This is what you're being hired for.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. Yeah. And look, culture change in any organization is very slow. People don't change fast. It is very hard to change a culture of an organization. As I've seen multiple times in multiple orgs that are set in their ways and getting them to change and trying to be a catalyst for change, is incredibly hard, especially if the incentives are not aligned.
So it's really funny because I used to joke early on that, I was among the wave of people who had early chief data officer jobs on Wall Street, and the job wasn't very well defined in the early days, right?
Right, I know.
And, the joke used to be any problem could ultimately be construed as a data problem and therefore handed off to the CDO to say, well, this is your problem. But I also used to say that in many ways, maybe the most important skill was like you were kind of the chief psychiatrist for the organization. You were trying to convince people, teach people, cajole people into managing data better, using data more effectively, protecting data more consciously. And it was this big like change management psychological component to it. Yeah. Here we are again with AI leaders, and we're saying the same thing, which is it's a culture problem as much as a technical problem.
And culture, it's funny. Yes, it is definitely culture as much as a technical problem. And like you said, culture is a harder thing to change. And most organizations don't change unless they have the proverbial gun to their head, and they're forced to change quickly.
Yeah.
They don't change for the sake of changing. Look, if they're looking at their quarterly numbers and they're good and their stock prices, doing well, they're not going to change. I worked at an organization where change was so necessary. They had so much legacy stuff, and it was evident that at some point it was going to be a real burden for them. But the quarterly stock price stood steady. Management was there for decades. Change was impossible. They didn't want to change. And, there'll come a day when they'll have to change, and changing is going to be very difficult for them.
I'm going to get a T-shirt that says "Inertia kills." That's going to be my
100%. Actually, when you and I teach classes, we should go put that T-shirt on. That's so
Inertia
true.
kills. Yeah,
I love that. True. Actually, it is true. It does.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, this has been a great conversation. Thanks. Yes. I enjoyed talking about this, and again, kudos to the authors of this article. I enjoyed reading it. I'd encourage you to go find the article. It was a good read, and I enjoyed the challenge of going a little deeper on it and talking about how we would approach it. I did want to bring up one other thing that I just read about. I read it this morning, Peter, so you'll get a kick out of this. So in our last podcast, we talked about Claudebot, which was later renamed as OpenClaw, and it's early 2026 as we're saying this. It's funny how even a week later, some of the hype died down around OpenClaw as people started to realize that it wasn't really ready for prime time. It was everywhere for a couple of weeks, and it's been a little bit quiet. But I did just read, ironically, that Meta's director of AI safety just posted that yesterday that she accidentally allowed OpenClaw to start deleting her email inbox. So she had, and there are no controls for this, and she couldn't stop it. So the story is she'd done it on a couple of test inboxes. She'd set up a task for OpenClaw and said, hey, go figure out what could be just deleted or archived without me having to respond to it. I've got too much junk in this email box. And she said explicitly, don't take any actions, don't delete anything, just tell me what you would propose and I will approve it before you do anything. And it worked perfectly on these smaller test inboxes. However, when she set it loose against her full massive inbox that probably had many, many thousands of messages in it, what ended up happening was the original instructions she gave it, plus all the content of the email box, was being pulled into a context window, and it got compressed.
No.
And the part of her, what she thinks happens is, the part of her instructions about not deleting anything without explicitly checking with her first got sort of lost in that compression.
Pressed along the way, it disappeared.
And it started actually executing her instructions and deleting stuff. And she started messaging the agent saying, stop right now, don't delete anything, stop. And it didn't respond. And she reported that she literally had to jump out of her seat, run across wherever she was to her Mac Mini that was, fortunately for her, it was running locally on a Mac Mini, and literally stop the process.
Well, I'm sorry.
if she'd been running in a cloud, she might not have been able to stop it as quickly. She was able to like get to the hardware and, either literally or figuratively unplug it.
Unplug it. Oh my, and look, I'm sorry, not surprised. And you and I said this, running this locally was downright dangerous. And it's funny you should say this. I had not heard that story, but there was another article I read, and I don't remember, recently, within the last couple of days, about the danger of running OpenClaw and how it's a security nightmare. And I'm like, yeah, like why would you give it all your keys to everything you own? I mean, you have to be
it's terrifying.
Insane.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I bring this up not to make fun of the director of AI safety, because to her credit, she posted about it, she was transparent about it, and she admitted it was sort of a rookie mistake, and she shared it as a learning opportunity. But it just, it reinforces how dangerous it can be to just wantonly give these tools access. We keep talking about controlled environment, controlled experimentation. This is a great example of why.
Great example. I mean, I'm sorry. I am not anytime soon giving a tool like that access to my computer where it can do whatever it wants. That's just, to me, pure insanity.
I told you, I did download it. I played with it. I played it with it on an old machine, and then I deleted it. And I still feel like I probably need to go like physically burn the hard drive on a campfire to be safe.
Some remnants of it is still around, lurking in the background. It's going to pop its head one day and take over your machine.
Exactly. I'm going to change my identity, change my phone numbers, change my emails, and everything.
Exactly.
Just to like,
it's going to still find a way. I find it. Exactly. Yeah, no. I mean, it's scary sometimes. Some of the power of these tools and what they're capable of doing, but can't say I'm surprised.
So I'm going to channel the patrol sergeant from Hill Street Blues. I'm dating myself, right? He used to end every pre-shift briefing with the phrase, "Let's be careful out there." And I feel like that's going to be my other tagline. Is I'm going to have to start saying to people, "Let's be careful out there."
Yes, I like that. That should be a new tagline. I like that.
Inertia kills, and let's be careful out there.
I like that. No, I think we should go with that. Those are the future taglines. Those work for me.
All right. So keep your eye open for the announcement of the All In on Data merchandise shop, where we'll have the T-shirts, coffee mugs, bumper stickers. Yeah.
Inertia kills. Let's be safe out there. It's so true, though. So true. It is funny, though. I have to laugh at all of this stuff sometimes, but hey,
it's it keeps life interesting, and
provides lots of fodder for us to talk about.
We've chewed up another morning talking about AI, but it's always interesting to have these chats with you, Peter. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. As always, been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for joining us on the All In on Data podcast. And we'll see you next time.
Yeah, everybody have a great day. And again, we love your comments, so please reach out. We encourage it. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
All right, take care. Bye, everyone.
Bye now.